The topic here is the four composition types in Tibetan painting, Tibetan murals, and scroll work generally. There are four types. The first is grouped figures, and this, again, like other things, is goes along in a kind of chronology. So we have grouped figures, registers, repeated figure, and floating figure composition. We have these four. The first of these grouped figure composition, this really derives from Indian painting styles, Indian painting aesthetics, where you have a large central figure and the secondary figures are grouped around the main figure, the sides, top and bottom, and often overlap each other, where you can have several figures appearing in the foreground, and then you have shoulders and heads, and finally heads, as if they're in a crowd in the background. So this is grouped figure. Sometimes, very occasionally, they can have a horizontal line at the top and bottom, and then they can have some additional figures. The second type is registers. Registers means you have a large central figure, and then above, below, and at the sides, you have many horizontal and vertical lines, and each figure has its own identity within its own box, within its own square of this grid work pattern of registers. Different than the register, the grouped figures we just previously mentioned, they are grouped together as part of the entourage of the central figure. Whereas in the registers, the register composition, they can be random figures, they could be completely different iconographic programs, a lot of variations. So the grouped figures, this comes essentially from India. Now, the very structured horizontal and vertical figures, this is really more of a Nepalese aesthetic with, of course, borrowings from India. The grouped figures, in terms of chronology, is from the 11th, 12th, 13th century. The very tight register composition, this is up until the 15th century and occasionally into the 16th century, and then it essentially ends. Then what we have is we have something called, it's a little bit out of the norm, but we have something called a repeated figure, where you have a central figure, but then you have hundreds of smaller figures surrounding that are all identical. So if you have a central Shakyamuni Buddha, then you can have a 100 or 200, 300 small Shakyamuni Buddhas surrounding, as if in a register structure, but without the physical lines, without the visual lines. Or you could have a Shakyamuni and 200 Taras, or you could have an Avalokiteshvara and 200 Vajrapanis. It all depends on the donor and the artist. Now, really the fourth and most important of the compositions in terms of what is the most common types of art we see today is the floating figure composition. And this really starts in the 15th century with the two Tibetan painting traditions, the Khenri and the Menri. From this period on, what we have is we have a central figure placed in the composition with other figures placed randomly to us, but not randomly to the donor or to the artist, as if hovering in space against a landscape which really has nothing to do, the background has nothing to do with the front figures. It's a modern convention of placing the figures according to a new idea of hierarchy. And also introducing a lot more landscape into the composition. So floating figure is the most common that you find up until the 21st century.